Okay, everybody, welcome to part three of our nearpod Civil War homework. And part three is the war. And as I said before, the Civil War, you can take a whole class. You can spend a whole semester studying the Civil War. So in an AP American history class, we're going to it's going to be a survey class. We're really not going to spend as much time on battles and the meat and potatoes of the war, but we're interested in the impact of the war, political, economic, social changes that the war encourages. But the actual war itself we're not going to get into the depths of, grand strategies or what made Robert E. Lee a brilliant general. But I'm going to very briefly go over the Civil War with you. And I encourage you to do the reading that corresponds to this topic, which I believe is chapter 13. So if you look at the war, I like to think of this as kind of like before boxers fight, right? So what's the tail of the tape? In everything that you can measure, the North was stronger. They had a larger population. They had a large navy. They had a strong economy. They controlled the railroads. That's incredibly important in war. The ability to move both supplies and troops around quickly is incredibly important in war. And they had an established, strong central government. Ironically enough, in what the South was fighting for, a weak central government, they wanted stronger state governments. In what they were fighting for, actually made it more difficult for them to win the war because they didn't want a strong government. And interestingly enough, there are actually small pockets of secession within the South during the Civil War. So this idea of secession and a weak central government is going to come back to hurt the South. So if this were a tail of the tape, you'd be like, well, this is it. The North's going to win easily. But everything that you can't measure, those intangible things, the South seemed to have the advantage. So they were fighting on their own land. Well, that's nothing you can measure. That's not like a number of people or number of troops or amount of railroads. But what's that worth, fighting on your own land? Understanding the terrain, the emotional motivation that fighting on your own land had. The South had the greatest military leaders of the day, most famously Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. These men were widely considered to be brilliant military tacticians. Then there's this idea of cotton diplomacy that the South had, was such an important part of the English textiles, that the Southern cotton, that they would probably, England would probably get involved and help the South. So the idea of cotton diplomacy. And then lastly, they didn't have to win. They didn't have to win a complete victory. They didn't have to win they only needed to win a political victory. And what do I mean by that? They just needed to fight long enough until the North no longer wanted to fight. It's interesting that the South saw themselves very much like the American revolutionaries. And similarly, the American revolutionary generation didn't have to defeat England. They didn't have to march down the streets of London, but they just needed to fight long enough for England to stop wanting to fight. And that's essentially what happened. And similarly, the South saw themselves as all they needed to do was hold out. They didn't have to, what I say, a win-win. They didn't have to defeat the North. They just needed to hold out long enough to discourage the North from wanting to fight anymore. And essentially, they came incredibly close to doing that. So as we go through the war, there's a lot to talk about. The first Battle of Bull Run illustrated that this was going to be a long war. There's this horrible story where people went to picnic to watch the battle, and just immediately their romanticized version of war had been destroyed. And it was immediately obvious that this was going to be a long, horrible, bloody war. Robert E. Lee, who was offered command of the Union Army, was opposed to slavery personally, but was from Virginia and loved his state, could not fight against his home state, resigns his commission from the United States Army and immediately becomes the most important general that the South has. I write he shows his genius. And then there's this General McClellan. McClellan, who was incredibly highly regarded, had the nickname Young Napoleon. McClellan is going to show his slowness. There's a great story, I love it, where McClellan would never fight. He would never engage. He always believed that Robert E. Lee had more troops and that it was a trap and a trick. And McClellan was just out-generaled by Robert E. Lee at every turn. And at one point, Abraham Lincoln sent McClellan a letter that said, "If you're not using the army, may I borrow it?" McClellan, who saw himself as better, smarter than Lincoln, will run against Lincoln for the presidency in 1864, is in many ways an inept general. Whether he did this purposefully, some people believed that he was not strongly opposed to slavery, that he wanted to become, as I said earlier, president, that he wanted to let the South secede and allow them their own country. Whether McClellan was purposefully throwing the war has been debated, or whether he was just too careful. You know, he loved his men. He didn't want to see them slaughtered, or whether he was inept. Either way, he was incredibly ineffective. What's interesting about these two guys, McClellan and Lee, is that they both prolonged the war. The war could have been earlier, could have been ended earlier. Had it been ended earlier, would it have been ended with slavery ending as a condition? Both Robert E. Lee and McClellan prolonged the war, and the impact of that is very debatable. Second Battle of Bull Run, again, Lee shows his brilliance. Now, Lee attempts to invade the North on a few occasions, and Antietam is one. Lee is stopped at Antietam. It's one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. Lincoln uses that as an opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which I'd spoke about earlier in this presentation. Moving on, there's just so many little stories about the Civil War. The Battle of Fredericksburg, in which General Burnside. Now you have to Google this guy. Google image this guy for me right now. Pause this presentation, open up a tab, because he is the reason that today we call sideburns, and he's just a very interesting looking guy. He once told Lincoln that he wasn't ready for this command, and Lincoln, being Lincoln, said, "Oh no, you'll be fine, you'll be fine." But Burnside was right. He recklessly attacked Lee in a well-fortified city called Fredericksburg and was destroyed. Some incredibly important firsts. The first battle of ironclad ships happened during the Civil War, famously the Monitor versus the Merrimack. And then Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, who had been a failure in almost everything he had done in life, had slowly worked his way up and had distinguished himself in the South at both Shiloh and Vicksburg. As I said before, he had a checkered past, Grant, and had earlier in his career been dismissed for drinking. And he gets on Lincoln's radar, and Lincoln starts to ask about Grant and says, "What about Grant? Grant seems to win. Perhaps I'll promote Grant to be the head of the Northern Army." And one of Lincoln's advisors says, "No, sir, you don't want Grant. He drinks. He's a drinker." And Lincoln famously said, "Let me know what he drinks and I'll send a case to all of my generals." So Grant will eventually take control. And I certainly don't want to skip Gettysburg. Prior to Gettysburg, Grant will take control after, I should say. Prior to Grant taking control, there's this battle at Gettysburg, 3 days. It's considered the turning point of the war. Again, Lee tries to bring the war to the North because he wanted to encourage the North to quit, to stop fighting. Lee is defeated. Lincoln gives one of the most important speeches in American history, largely considered the most important speech, the Gettysburg Address, where he frames the past, he speaks of the present, and he talks about what the future of America will hold. And we'll talk more about this speech in class. It's too important to to do virtually through a presentation like this. Now, Grant becomes head of the Northern Army, and it's important to note that Grant wasn't the brilliant tactician that Lee was, a butcher and a winner. Now, Grant was willing to sacrifice his men. Grant lost more men, but never allowed Lee to retreat. He never allowed Lee to evade him. He just kept the pressure on. Similarly, Sherman, no relationship to me, but General William Tecumseh Sherman engaged in something called total war, and in some ways changes the definition of war for many. He burns down farms. He destroys railroads. He once said, "War is hell. Thank God, lest we grow to love it." So he really changes the definition of war. And this idea of total war, I think, is something that we see today. Eventually, through Grant's ruthless pursuit of Lee and Sherman's devastation of the South finally surrenders at Appomattox. A very brief overview of the Civil War and the battles. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, but that gives you just a brief overview. Real quick, a little bit about what really won the war, what some people say, and that's foreign diplomacy. You know, Lincoln believed that other than keeping the border states in the Union, nothing was more important than keeping England and other foreign countries, but most notably England, out of the war. And, you know, if the South was King Cotton, then the North was King Wheat and King Corn. And it turned out that those European countries were just as dependent on American wheat and corn as they were in cotton. I'm going to drop down here to nice weather in Egypt, because this seems really out of left field. But for those of you who are interested in kind of the global view of history that's very popular now, some historians have said that the weather in Egypt during the years of the Civil War was the real reason why the North won the war. And that might come across as a paradox or a puzzle and cause you to scratch your head. Well, what could the weather in Egypt have to do with the outcome of the Civil War? And many of you are probably 2 steps ahead of me. Egypt, of course, is another important producer of cotton. And the weather being advantageous to cotton during those years allowed England to keep their textiles running. Had Egypt not been able to produce the cotton that was needed for England to continue the economic output that is, of course, so important to them, would they have gotten involved in the war? We'll never know, but it's certainly an interesting thesis. Lincoln's strong stance when Mason and Slidell, 2 Southern advisors, attempted to go to England, and Lincoln taking the ship and refusing them to leave the country, bringing America to the brink of a confrontation with England. Lincoln was always walking a tightrope. And remember, his major goals was keeping the border states in the Union and keeping England out of the war. And the Confiscation Acts, which essentially said that slaves would be freed. You know, when slaves are found, they would be confiscated and like their property, but they would be freed. This made the issue of slavery more prevalent in terms of the war. The South argued that this war wasn't even about slavery. It's about states' rights. And if that's true, then England may have been more obliged to get on their side. But because England was opposed to slavery, they were not in favor of supporting the South. And Lincoln's use of the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's use of the Confiscation Acts really highlighted that a major goal of the war was to end slavery. And that helped to keep England out of the war. All right, so let me stop here. You have a few activities to do, and then we're 75% done.